I never thought that at the age of 68 I would be standing on the doorstep of my son's house with a shabby suitcase and a cardboard box containing everything that was left of my life. The pouring rain is a symbol of my pathetic situation. My wool coat was damp and musty. It was like me, long out of fashion. Howie opened the door and I saw his face. Frowning eyebrows, tightly compressed lips, politeness without a drop of warmth. He took my suitcase and set it in the hallway, as if he was afraid I'd change my mind and run back to my lost home. "Father," was all he said, stepping aside so I could enter. Even in a moment like this, he couldn't call me Dad. Always father, formal and cold. I deserved it, though. I deserved his alienation years ago when I was too busy to come to his school plays, too tired to play with him, and too withdrawn to tell him I loved him. My son's house turned out just as I expected. Neat, impersonal, like a page from a furniture catalog. No trace of character or personality. Framed pictures bought in bulk, sofas with cushions that no one had ever rumpled. And everywhere those colors: beige, cream, light brown, the colors of caution. "Your room is upstairs," Howie said, pointing to the stairs. "Last door on the right, bathrooms across the hall, dinner's at 6. Then he just went off to another room, leaving me to figure it out on my own. Typical of our relationship. I'd never taught him how to express emotions, so I couldn't expect warmth now. I walked slowly up the stairs, cursing my arthritis and the pride that kept me from picking up my cane. The room turned out to be small but clean. A single bed, a desk, a closet. Apparently it used to be an office turned bedroom for an unwanted guest. For me. I set the box on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. Just 5 days ago, I was in my own home, where I'd lived for 36 years. The house Evelyn and I had bought after my promotion at the post office, where Howie was raised, where she died 3 years ago. The mortgage, the medical bills for her care, my fixed retirement income, all led to the inevitable. The bank took the house, and I ended up here, in a guest room in my own son's house. There was a soft knock on the door. "May I come in?" Without waiting for an answer, the door opened, and I saw a small face framed by red curls. Pearl, my granddaughter, 6 years old, far less time than I'd spent avoiding becoming a real grandfather. "Hello, Grandpa Eustace," she said, slipping into the room with the important look that only little children have when they are sure of their mission. "Are you really going to live with us now?" "I guess so," I answered, trying to soften my voice. I always sounded like a postmaster to the kids, clear and unemotional. Pearl came closer, eyeing me with undisguised curiosity. "You have a beard like a wizard," she said at last. "Can I touch it?" I grinned involuntarily. My gray beard, which I'd grown since retirement, had never been compared to a magic beard. "You can," I said, leaning forward. Her small fingers touched my beard gingerly, as if she really expected sparks of magic to fly from it. "Spiky," she concluded with seriousness, "but beautiful." At that moment, Gracie, my sister-in-law, appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in homemade clothes, her hair in a casual bun. I'd always thought Howie married above his league. Gracie came from a family with money and education, and my son, well, he only had me. "Pearl, leave Grandpa alone. He needs to rest," she said, trying to sound friendly, but I could hear the strain in her voice. "Welcome, Eustace. Make yourself comfortable. Did Howie show you where the bathroom is?" "Eustace, not Dad. I don't deserve a family title." "Yes, thank you," I nodded. "The room is lovely, a lie we both accepted for the sake of politeness. The room was as impersonal as a cheap motel room, but it was better than sleeping in a car or a shelter." "Oh, great. Dinner will be ready in an hour," she said, and added in a sterner tone, "Pearl, come on, let Grandpa get settled in." Pearl pouted her lips but obeyed. "See you for dinner, Grandpa the Wizard," she whispered conspiratorially before slipping out the door. I was left alone with a box of memories and a suitcase of clothes. There were voices coming from downstairs. I knew what they were talking about the burden I had become, about the awkwardness of my presence, about how long I would have to live here. I started unpacking, underwear and socks into the top drawer of the dresser, shirts and pants in the closet, Evelyn's picture on the nightstand. She was smiling, holding the bouquet of roses I'd given her for our 30th anniversary. 5 years before her diagnosis, 8 years before she died. Dinner turned out to be a quiet ordeal. Howie sat at the head of the table like the king of his little kingdom. Gracie served the food and kept the conversation awkward. Pearl cast curious glances at me between spoonfuls of soup. "How was your day, Eustace?" Gracie asked when the silence grew heavy. My day, I thought bitterly. My day began with saying goodbye to my home forever and ended with being a freeloader for my own son. "No incident," I replied. "Thank you for dinner, it's delicious." "It's just soup out of a bag," Howie said. "Howie," Gracie shushed him. "What? It's true," he said without looking at me. We weren't expecting company. Not guests, but father, I thought. But I kept my mouth shut. I was grateful that I had a roof over my head, that I didn't have to beg for a place in a nursing home or worse, a homeless shelter. "I love soup from a bag," Pearl interjected, smiling at me. "Especially with crackers." I smiled back at her. Kids have a gift for diffusing the atmosphere without even realizing it. "Me too," I said. "When your daddy was little, that was his favorite dish." Howie looked up, surprise in his eyes, like he hadn't expected me to remember such details. "Did he?" Pearl turned to her father. "Did you like soup out of a bag, Daddy?" Howie shrugged, but his face softened a little. "Yes, especially chicken and noodles." "He asked for it every Sunday," I added, feeling a strange need to cling to those tiny shards of normalcy. "Your grandmother always kept a supply in the pantry." "Tell me about your grandmother," Pearl asked, resting her hands on her chin. "I don't remember her. I don't. Evelyn died when Pearl was only 3. Too young to have any real memories." I looked at Howie, silently asking for permission. He nodded slightly, as if giving me a chance. "Your grandmother was the kindest woman I've ever met," I began, feeling a lump forming in my throat. "She had red hair, just like yours, and she could bake the most delicious chocolate chip cookies in the world." "Better than Mom's?" Pearl asked in a whisper, glancing at Gracie. "Pearl!" Gracie exclaimed, but there was laughter in her voice. "Another," I replied diplomatically, "with a secret ingredient." "What is it?" Pearl's eyes widened with curiosity. "It wouldn't be a secret if I told you," I winked at her, and she giggled. For a moment, the atmosphere at the table was almost normal, almost like a real family. But the moment was shattered when Howie pushed his plate away and coughed. "Pearl, finish your soup. It's getting late, and it's time for you to get ready for bed," he said in a tone that brooked no objection. "Grandfather and I need to talk about house rules." "Oh, that's it. House rules. Like I'm a teenager and not his father. Like I'm a guest, not the man who taught him how to use a spoon, tie his shoelaces, and ride a bike." After dinner, when Gracie took Pearl upstairs for her evening bath, Howie and I stayed in the kitchen. He did the dishes, I did the wiping. How strange to do such a domestic task with a man who came out of you but has become so distant, almost a stranger. "Listen, Father," Howie began, not stopping what he was doing. "I know this isn't easy for you right now. Losing your home, especially after Mom. It's hard, but I have to be honest. It's a temporary situation." "Temporary," echoed in my head. Of course it is. Who wants to live with a 68-year-old man for longer than necessary? "I understand," I said, wiping off another plate. "I'm grateful for the roof over my head." "It's not just that." Howie turned off the water and turned to me. "We have certain routines. Pearl goes to school. Gracie works remotely 3 days a week. I leave at 7 in the morning and get back at 6 at night. We don't want to change our lifestyle. I'm not asking for it." I tried to keep my voice even, though I was seething with humiliation inside. "Okay," he nodded. "Here are the rules then. No noise in the morning before 7. No occupying the bathroom for more than 20 minutes. No touching the thermostat. If you want any of the groceries, write it down on the list on the refrigerator. No inviting guests over unannounced. He fell silent, clearly choosing words for something unpleasant. I nudged him. "And we need to talk about the financial side," he said finally. "I know you have a pension. Not much, but still." "Oh, that's it. Money. Always money." "You want me to pay your rent?" I asked him bluntly. His face flushed slightly, but he didn't look away. "Contributing to the family budget would be fair, don't you think?" he said. "An extra person in the house is an extra expense. Water, electricity, food." I nodded silently. It was humiliating but logical. I'm a burden, and my own son wants to make sure that this burden isn't too heavy on his budget. "How much?" I asked. He named the amount, and I felt something inside me snap. It was almost half of my monthly pension. "I understand," I said, though I didn't really understand. I didn't understand how my own son could bill his father. But did I have a right to complain? Was I any better as a father? I'll transfer at the beginning of each month. Howie nodded, as if we had just made a business deal, not an agreement about how a son would support his father in his old age. Okay, he said. One more thing. About Pearl. What about her? She's impressionable, Howie said carefully. And Gracie and I are trying to raise her in a certain way, without those old-fashioned attitudes and prejudices. I felt a wave of irritation rising in me. Old-fashioned attitudes. As if my life, my experiences were some kind of museum piece, a dust collector to be kept away from an impressionable child. I'm not going to teach her anything bad, I said coldly. That's not what I meant, Howie replied quickly. It's just, we want her to grow up to be a modern person, understanding, open-minded, unlike me. He didn't say it out loud, but I heard it in the subtext. Unlike his father, who was closed, reserved, emotionally unavailable. I understand, I said again. Though what I really wanted to ask was, when did we become such strangers to each other? When did my son start looking at me as a potential threat to his daughter? I'll be careful what I say to her. The conversation ended shortly after that. Howie went upstairs to help put Pearl down, and I stayed in the kitchen, unsure of what to do next. In my house, I'd be sitting in a rocking chair in the backyard right now, probably with a glass of whiskey, looking at the stars and thinking about Evelyn. Here I was a stranger, unsure even if I could take an apple from the fruit vase without permission. I went up to my room and closed the door. Tomorrow I would start looking for a job, something an old man with only post office experience can do. Maybe a night watchman or a cashier, anything to pay my share and save up for my own place. Because it's clear that my stay here won't be so temporary. I'm 68, with arthritis and incipient cataracts. Who's going to hire me for a job with a decent wage? I lay in someone else's bed and stared at the ceiling. In the quiet of the house, I could hear the muffled voices of Howie and Gracie from the next room. They were talking about me, I was sure. About the burden I had become. About how long they could bear it. I closed my eyes, remembering the house that no longer belonged to me. Remembering Evelyn and her smile. Remembering little Howie, who had once looked at me as a hero instead of a burden. This is temporary, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that temporary could stretch on for weeks, months, years, until I became completely infirm, or until Howie's patience ran out. And then what? Nursing home, orphanage, death alone. I turned on my side and allowed myself one tear, just one, because that's what I taught my son. Men don't cry. And now I was reaping the rewards of my lessons. For the first week at my son's house, I literally tiptoed around. I got up at 5 in the morning, washed my face quietly, and sat in my room until I heard the family wake up. Ate what was offered without complaining. Gave thanks for every little thing, like a beggar who'd been tossed a coin. Howie left early. I'd catch a glimpse of him at breakfast, swallowing his oatmeal, kissing Pearl on the top of her head, nodding to Gracie, and throwing a discreet, "See you tonight" in my direction. Not once a "bye, Dad" or "see you, Dad." Just the impersonal goodbye of a man in a hurry to leave the house. Gracie worked remotely 3 days a week, sitting for hours at her computer in her home office, the former guest bedroom. Now the guest bedroom was mine, and she was squatting in a room filled with boxes and old furniture. Another reminder of my intrusion into their lives. When she left for the office, Pearl would go to her neighbor, an elderly woman named Dolores who looked after the children of several families. On days like that, the house fell into silence, and I was alone with my thoughts and regrets. I looked for work. I went around to stores and gas stations asking for openings. Everywhere I received a polite refusal. We're looking for someone younger. We need someone with retail experience. We're considering candidates with the possibility of a long-term perspective. Euphemisms for, "You're too old." After a week of rejections, I decided to give the library a try. Not that I'm a big fan of books, but it was quiet, warm, and most importantly, free. I could sit there for hours pretending to read the newspaper, watching people and thinking about my situation. One day I noticed an ad on the board. Night watchman needed, Doug's parking lot, full or part-time, no experience required. I wrote down the address and phone number. It was a job I could do. Sit in a booth, keep an eye on the cars, deter vandals. I doubt my age would get in the way. But when I called, I was told the position was already taken. I didn't believe it. The ad had only been up yesterday. But who's going to argue with an old man? When I got back, I found Gracie in the kitchen. She was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables with methodical precision. "How was your day?" she asked, not looking up from the cutting board. "Not bad," I lied. "Went to the library." She nodded, continuing to chop carrots. "Were you looking for anything in particular?" "Not really," I stammered. Should I tell her I was looking for a job? "Just hanging out." Gracie finally looked up. Her eyes were tired, with a shadow of dark circles. "Eustace," she began cautiously, "I know this is a difficult situation for all of us, but I want you to know that Howie and I are not throwing you out on the street." Her words should have been comforting. Instead, they only emphasized my helplessness. "I'm grateful," I said formally, "but I don't want to be a burden to your family." "You're not a burden," she said automatically. A lie we both recognized. "You are family." Another lie. I wasn't family. I was an inconvenient relative who was sheltered out of a sense of duty, not love. "Anyway," I continued, "I will continue to look for work, to contribute more." Gracie put the knife aside and wiped her hands. "Eustace," she said softly, but with a note of patronization that I hated, "you're 68. You should be resting, not working." Rest, I thought bitterly, as if idleness were a reward for living to a ripe old age. "I'm perfectly capable of working," I said, trying not to sound defensive. "I have experience. I was postmaster for 30 years. "I know," she nodded. "And that's impressive. But things are different now. Everywhere you need computer skills, certificates." She didn't finish, but I heard the unspeakable. "Youth. You need youth everywhere." "I can learn," I said stubbornly. "Computers, the internet, it's not that hard." Gracie smiled as if I were a naive child. "Of course you can. But why would you do that? Enjoy a well-deserved vacation. A well-deserved vacation in someone else's house, on someone else's terms, under someone else's control." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening and Pearl's joyous cry. "Grandfather, I'm home!" She burst into the kitchen like a little whirlwind, with disheveled red hair and sparkling eyes. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Grandpa the Wizard. Look what I drew today." She handed me a piece of paper with a human figure with a huge beard, and it seems a magic wand. "It's you," Pearl announced proudly. "Grandpa's a wizard." I felt something clench in my chest. It had been so long since a child had drawn me lovingly. "It's very similar," I said, smiling. "Especially the beard." "Pearl," Gracie intervened, "go wash your hands. Dinner will be ready soon." "May I show Grandfather my room first?" Pearl asked with that special pleading tone that children have mastered to perfection. Gracie sighed. "Okay, but quickly. 5 minutes." Pearl grabbed my hand and dragged me upstairs with surprising strength for such a small person. Her room was the complete opposite of the sterile neatness of the rest of the house. Bright colors, toys everywhere, drawings taped to the walls. "This is my castle," Pearl announced, pointing to the pink canopy bed. "And this is my library, a shelf of children's books, neatly arranged by size. And this is my secret stash." She lowered her voice to a whisper and pointed to a small wooden box under the bed. "That's where I keep my treasures." "What treasure?" I asked, playing along. Pearl looked around as if checking to see if anyone was listening and opened the box. Inside were seashells, colored pebbles, a dried flower, a few bright feathers, and a small silver brooch in the shape of a rose. I froze. It was the brooch I'd given Evelyn for our first anniversary when we were young and poor. "Where did you get this?" I asked, pointing to the brooch. "Daddy gave it to me," Pearl replied, touching the silver rose gently. "He said it was Grandma's. Used to be great-grandmother's." I felt my eyes water. Howie kept the brooch and passed it on to his daughter. Maybe all is not lost between us. "It really belonged to your grandmother," I said quietly. "I gave her that brooch a long time ago." "You did?" Pearl's eyes widened. "Then it's a real magical treasure, from a real wizard." I didn't try to dissuade her. At 6 years old, you have a right to believe in magic. After 2 weeks at my son's house, I began to notice how my presence was changing their routine. Gracie became more tense, constantly checking to see if I was comfortable. Howie seemed more and more distant, staying late at work. Pearl was the only one who was happy to have me around. She came to my room every day after school, showed me her drawings, told me about her friends and teachers. One day, when Pearl was at school and Gracie was at the office, I decided to do something useful. I noticed that the front lawn hadn't been mowed in a while and thought it was the perfect opportunity to do my part. I found a lawnmower in the garage and got to work. It was a warm day, the sun was shining, and soon I could feel the sweat running down my back. The old mower rattled and stalled every few minutes, but I persevered. I was determined to prove that I could still be useful. By the time I finished the front part of the lawn, my arms were shaking with fatigue and something uncomfortably tight in my chest. I took a seat on the porch to rest, and it was at that moment that Howie's car pulled up. He got out of the car and froze, looking at me, then at the half-mowed lawn. "What are you doing?" he asked, and I heard irritation in his voice, not gratitude. "Mowing the lawn," I answered, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I noticed it hadn't been mowed in a while. "We hire a gardener," Howie said through gritted teeth. "He comes every 2 weeks. He was supposed to come tomorrow." "Oh," was all I could say. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't." Howie walked past me into the house, slamming the door. I remained sitting on the porch, feeling like a complete idiot. Of course they have a gardener. Everyone in this neighborhood has a gardener. I should have asked before taking the initiative. The days merged into weeks, and my presence in the house became increasingly awkward. I tried to adapt to their lifestyle, but I kept bumping into invisible boundaries. I made myself breakfast, but I was using the wrong pan. I watched TV, but the volume was too high. I washed my clothes, but the washing machine program was inefficient. Every action I took seemed to irritate Howie. He never yelled or swore, but his quiet disapproval was worse than any yelling. Gracie tried to soften the situation, but I could see that her patience was wearing thin as well. Only Pearl seemed glad of my presence. She brought me her drawings, asking me to tell stories about the way things used to be. She was my only ray of light in that house. One night I heard Howie and Gracie talking quietly in the kitchen. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when I heard my name, I involuntarily slowed my step as I walked by. "Can't go on like this," Howie said. "He doesn't fit into our way of life, Gracie. I realize he's my father, but—" "He's trying, Howie," Gracie said. "He just needs time to adjust." "Time?" Howie sounded annoyed. "It's been almost 3 weeks. What's changed? He's still doing things his own way, ignoring our rules, teaching Pearl outdated things." "What things?" Gracie asked, and I was grateful to her for asking. "Yesterday he told her that girls should be nice and neat," Howie said. "Do you know how much time we spent explaining to her that she could be anything she wanted to be? That there were no girl things and boy things?" I remembered that conversation. Pearl was telling me how she had jumped in a puddle in the schoolyard and soiled her new dress. I actually said something like, "Little ladies have to be neat." It was just an old-fashioned expression, nothing more. But to Howie, it was further proof of my unfitness as a grandfather. "He's from a different generation, Howie." Gracie's voice sounded conciliatory. "He doesn't mean any harm." "Maybe not," Howie sighed. "But that doesn't change the fact that he's affecting Pearl, and not in the direction we want to raise her." I quietly walked away, not wanting to hear anymore. So here's the thing. I'm not just an inconvenient neighbor. I'm a detrimental influence on their child. My values, my experiences, my whole life, all of it was something Pearl needed to be shielded from. That thought haunted me all night. I lay awake thinking about how times had changed. When I was a young father, parents and older relatives were considered a source of wisdom and experience. They were listened to, respected. Now I was a relic of the past, whose views were considered outdated and harmful. The next morning, trying to be helpful and not break their rules at the same time, I decided to wash the dishes that had been left over from the evening. Gracie always left it for the morning, which I thought was odd. My mother and Evelyn never went to bed without leaving dirty dishes in the sink. I tried to be careful, but one of the cups, thin, porcelain, with a gold border, slipped from my soapy hands and shattered in the sink. The sound of shattered china echoed through the quiet morning house. "What happened?" Gracie appeared in the kitchen in her robe, a worried look on her face. "I'm sorry," I said, showing her the splinters. "I was doing the dishes and—" "Oh no," she exhaled when she saw what I'd broken. "It was a cup from my grandmother's set. They don't make them anymore." "I didn't know," I said, feeling the color flood my face. "I was just trying to help." "Why were you doing dishes in the first place?" Gracie asked, and I could hear a note of tired irritation in her voice. "We have a dishwasher." "I'm used to washing by hand," I replied. And I thought, "That's the problem, Eustace," Gracie interrupted me. "You think your own way. You do things your own way. You don't ask. You don't ask about our habits, our rules." I stood there holding the remaining shards in my hand, not knowing what to say. She was right. I was acting out of habit, not thinking about the fact that they might have other ways of doing ordinary things. "I'll replace the cup," I finally said, "or make up for the cost of it." Gracie shook her head. "This isn't about the cup, Eustace. It's about you not trying to fit into our family. You're not trying to understand how we live. You just, do things your own way." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the cup shards and guilt. I carefully picked up all the shards and threw them away, then washed the remaining dishes and put them away in the closet, hoping I had at least done that right. In the evening of the same day, another incident occurred. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when Pearl came up to me with a clipboard. "Grandpa, look at this." She held out the device to me. "I found a new game." I took the tablet carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact from another world. On the screen were brightly colored cartoon figures, something to do with farms and animals. "Very interesting," I said, not quite sure what exactly I was supposed to do. "No, you have to play." Pearl climbed into my lap. "Look, you press here and the animals dance." I tried to follow her instructions, but my fingers were too clumsy for the touchscreen. I accidentally closed the game, then opened some other app, then the screen went out. "Oops," Pearl said disappointedly. "You broke the game." "I didn't," I said, trying to turn the screen back on. I don't know how it works." At that moment, Howie walked into the room. When he saw the tablet in my hands, he frowned. "Pearl, you know the rules. No screen time after 8. He took the tablet from my hands. "And don't give it to Grandpa. He doesn't know how to handle it." "I was just showing him my new game," Pearl pouted. "Next time ask permission." Howie turned off the tablet and put it back on the shelf. "And Grandpa needs to ask permission before he uses other people's stuff." I felt the color flood my face. He was talking about me like I wasn't in the room, like I was just another kid who needed to be mentored. "I didn't know about the rule about screens," I said, trying to sound calm. "And I didn't take the tablet. Pearl gave it to me." "It doesn't matter," Howie said. "A rule is a rule, and it applies to everyone." Pearl looked at me guiltily, then at her father. "I'm going to go brush my teeth," she said quietly, and slipped out of the room, leaving me and Howie alone. "Listen," I started when she was gone. "I realize that you have rules, and I try to follow them, but I can't follow rules I don't know about." "You could have asked," Howie said, "instead of assuming you know better." "I don't assume I know better," I objected. "I'm just doing what I'm used to doing." "Exactly." Howie crossed his arms over his chest. "You do what you're used to doing, not trying to learn how we do things, not trying to adapt to our house, our rules, our way of life." We stared at each other across the living room, two people from different worlds, different generations, unable to find common ground. "I'm trying," I said quietly, "but I can't change who I am." "No one's asking you to change," Howie said, but we both knew it was a lie. That's what he wanted me to be, someone else, someone who fit into their neat, orderly world. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, thinking about how much of an outsider I was in that house. Each day brought new conflicts, new evidence that I didn't fit in. And only Pearl seemed to accept me for who I was. To her, I was just Grandpa Wizard, not an outdated, bumbling old man who didn't know how to use a dishwasher or a tablet. But even my connection to Pearl was becoming a source of tension. I could see Howie and Gracie watching us, ready to intervene if I said something wrong or outdated. I felt like I was under a microscope, my every word and action being analyzed and judged. The tension in the house was building every day. Little incidents turned into big problems. A broken cup, improperly washed clothes, a television that was too loud, wrong stories told by Pearl. It all added up. I was an outsider, an intruder in their perfect world. And though neither Howie nor Gracie had said so explicitly, I sensed that their patience was wearing thin, that something was going to happen soon, something that would change our fragile cohabitation arrangement. I just didn't know when it would happen or what would be the final straw. Saturday morning was overcast, and so was my mood. I lay in bed listening to the rain drumming on the roof. In this weather, Evelyn and I liked to lie under the covers, drinking coffee in bed and whispering and making plans for the weekend. Now I had no one to share this simple joy with. I looked at the clock, 7 in the morning. The house was silent. On weekends, Howie and Gracie usually slept until 9, and Pearl could wake up at 6 or 11, unpredictably. I got up quietly, threw on my robe, and stepped cautiously out of the room. The kitchen was cool and empty. I turned on the kettle and pulled a cup from the cupboard, trying not to make any noise. In these moments of loneliness, I felt particularly acute my irrelevance in this house. In my own house, I would be turning on the radio, rattling dishes, frying eggs and bacon, not caring that the smell might wake someone up. Here I moved like a thief, afraid of disturbing someone else's peace. The kettle clicked on, and I poured boiling water over a bag of cheap tea. Howie and Gracie had some fancy green tea made out of little metal balls, but I'd never learned how to use it. I tried once, and the tea balls scattered all over the tabletop, causing Howie to have another temper tantrum. I sat down at the table and unfolded yesterday's newspaper, which Howie used to look through and throw away. I always pulled it out of the hamper. Another old-fashioned habit of mine, reading the printed news rather than watching it on my phone screen. "Grandpa?" came a quiet voice from the doorway. "Are you awake?" Pearl stood in her unicorn pajamas with disheveled hair and a sleepy face. "Good morning, sunshine," I said, smiling. "You're a little early today." I heard a noise. She rubbed her eyes. "Can I have some cereal?" "Sure." I stood up and pulled a box of her favorite cereal, the ones with chocolate balls, out of the cabinet. Gracie didn't usually let her eat those in the morning, preferring the healthier options, but what better way than a little conspiracy between grandfather and granddaughter? I poured milk into a bowl of cereal and set it in front of Pearl. She smiled sleepily and began to eat, looking at me with that special childlike curiosity that always amused me. "Grandfather, are you really a wizard?" she asked suddenly. I grinned. "Why would you think that?" "Because you have a beard like a wizard, and you know a lot of stories," she said without a shadow of irony, just stating a fact. "I'm afraid I'm just an ordinary man," I replied. "Just lived a little longer than the others." "You're like a wizard to me anyway," Pearl said, scooping up her cereal with a spoon. "You tell the best stories." I smiled, touched by her words. At least for someone in this house, I wasn't a burden, but a welcome guest. "What would you want me to do if I were a real wizard?" I asked. Pearl hesitated, stirring the cereal in her bowl. "I want you to stay with us forever," she said at last. "I want you to never leave." Her words pierced me. If only she knew how illusory my presence here was, how easily it could end. "I'll stay as long as I can," I said carefully, "but even wizards can't control some things." "What things?" Pearl asked. "Other people, for instance," I answered. "Their desires, their feelings." "Are you talking about Dad?" Pearl was remarkably perceptive for her 6 years. "He gets angry with you sometimes." "Yes," I saw no point in lying to her. "Sometimes he gets angry." "Why?" she asked. "You're his dad." "Sometimes fathers and children don't get along," I said, choosing my words. "They have different ways of looking at life, different habits." Pearl nodded, as if she understood what I was saying. "Like when I want to watch cartoons all night and Daddy says I can't?" I smiled. "Something like that, only a little more complicated." "Adults always make things more complicated." Pearl sighed with such adult disappointment that I couldn't help but laugh. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Howie came into the kitchen, already dressed and clearly annoyed. He glanced around the kitchen table, lingering on a bowl of chocolate cereal. "Pearl, you know the rules about breakfast on weekends," he said sternly. "But Grandpa said it was okay," Pearl objected. Howie looked at me, and I could see the fury in his eyes. "Of course he did," he said through gritted teeth. "Grandpa lets you do whatever Mom and Dad say you can't do, doesn't he?" "I didn't know there were rules about cereal," I said, trying to sound conciliatory. "Pearl just asked for it, and you decided you could ignore our parental guidelines," Howie finished for me, like always. "Dad, don't be mad," Pearl interjected. "I'm the one who asked." Howie took a deep breath, obviously trying to calm down. "Finish eating and go get dressed," he said to Pearl. "We're going to Aunt Allison's for lunch, remember?" Pearl nodded and quickly finished the rest of her cereal, looking at us anxiously. When she left, Howie turned to me. "You can't undermine our authority," he said quietly, but with tension in his voice. "Gracie and I made the rules for a reason. We're watching Pearl's diet. Those chocolate bombs are for special occasions only." "I didn't know," I said again. "But it's just cereal, Howie. A little chocolate won't kill her." "It's not the cereal." Howie shook his head. "It's the principle. You keep breaking our rules, ignoring our requests, doing things your own way." The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Howie, Gracie, and Pearl were getting ready to go to Gracie's sister's house, and I was sitting in my room, trying to read but unable to concentrate. Howie's words were swirling around in my head, reinforcing the sense of rejection I felt in this house. Around 11 o'clock they left, leaving me alone. I usually enjoyed these moments of solitude when I could watch TV without headphones or listen to the radio loudly. But today the house seemed too empty, too foreign. I decided to clean up my room a bit. In the month I'd lived here, I'd accumulated quite a bit of stuffed books from the library, old newspapers I couldn't bring myself to throw away, notes I'd taken while trying to find a job. It was all lying in disarray on the desk and shelves, which I knew annoyed Gracie, though she never said so directly. Among the papers, I came across an old picture of me, Evelyn, and little Howie on the beach. He was about 4, sitting on my shoulders, laughing with delight. Evelyn was looking at us with that special smile that was just for the two of us. We were happy then, or so it seemed to me. But looking back, I realized that even then I was working too much, too seldom at home, too often leaving Evelyn alone with the baby. The day dragged on slowly. I ate the leftovers from last night's dinner, watched a little TV, tried to read. Around 5 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling up. They were back earlier than I expected. I walked out into the hallway ready to greet them, but froze when I saw Howie and Gracie's faces. Something's wrong. "Pearl, go to your room," Howie said in a tone that didn't tolerate objection. "Mommy will help you change." Pearl went upstairs obediently, but on the stairs she turned around and gave me a worried look. She could feel the tension, as all children do. As soon as she and Gracie were upstairs, Howie turned to me. His face was stony, but his eyes were burning. "Allison said an interesting thing today," he began without preamble. "She said she saw you in town this week, outside the bank." I nodded, not sure what he was getting at. "Yeah, I went there on Wednesday, checked on my account. And I met with the loan officer," Howie added. "Allison said you were in his office for at least an hour." "I don't see how that matters," I said carefully. "It's my personal business." "Your personal business?" Howie grinned bitterly. "Not when you use my address. Not when you list me as a bail bondsman." I felt a chill run down my spine. How did he know? "Allison's friends with the manager's wife," Howie said, as if he'd read my mind. "Small town. Everybody knows everybody. She asked why my father needed a $20,000 loan. I didn't know what she was talking about, of course." I swallowed, feeling my mouth dry. "I was going to tell you," I began. "When everything's ready—" "Done?" Howie interrupted me, his voice rising an octave. "What exactly will be ready, Father? Were you planning to take out a loan in my name without asking me?" "Not in your name," I objected. "Just with you as guarantor. I need money to start a new life, rent an apartment, maybe start a small business." "Business?" Howie was almost shouting now. "At 68? After you lost your house to debt? And you think a bank's going to give you a loan without a guarantor? Who, by the way, will pay when you go broke?" "I'm not going broke," I said, feeling the anger rising in me. "I have a plan. I've got it all figured out." "How have you thought through your retirement?" Howie shook his head. "How did you think through Mom's medical treatment? How did you think about paying off the mortgage?" "It's not fair," I said quietly. "You don't know all the circumstances." "I know enough," Howie cut me off. "I know you're an irresponsible man who's always made bad decisions. And now that your decisions have brought you into my house, you're trying to involve me in your financial ventures." His words hit me like a physical blow. I've never heard Howie speak to me with such contempt. "I'm trying to get back on my feet," I said, barely containing the tremor in my voice. "Not to be a burden to you and your family." "A burden?" Howie laughed bitterly. "You're already a burden. You live in my house, eat my food, use my things, and now you want me to risk my credit rating, my financial future for your crazy ideas?" "They're not delusional," I countered, feeling a rage rise up inside me that I hadn't felt in years. "You've always thought that, haven't you? That I'm a failure? That I can't do anything right?" "Isn't that right?" Howie looked at me with defiance. "Look at your life, Dad. Where's your savings? Where's your house? Where are the results of all those years you spent working instead of being with your family?" "Don't you dare talk to me like that," I said through gritted teeth. "You don't know what I've been through, what I did for you and your mother." "Oh, I know enough." Howie didn't back down. "I know you always put work before family. I know Mom was always defending you, saying you were doing it all for us. But the truth is, you just didn't want to be with us. Work was your escape from your responsibilities, from the responsibility of being a husband and father. Every word he said cracked like a whip. And worst of all, there was some truth to them. I did work too much, came home late too often, missed too much of Howie's life. But not because I didn't love them. It was because I was afraid of failing, of not providing, of not being good enough. You don't understand anything, I said, and my voice sounded tired. I was doing the best I could. And this is what it's come to. Howie spread his arms wide. You're living at the mercy of a son you barely know. You've lost everything, and now you're trying to get me into your debt. I didn't ask you for favors, I countered. I'm paying my rent. I'm looking for work. I'm trying not to interfere with your life. Not very successfully, Howie snorted. You're breaking our rules. You're undermining our authority in front of Pearl. You're trying to use me as a financial cushion for your crazy ideas. Enough! I raised my voice, unable to hold back any longer. I'm your father, not some hustler off the street. I deserve respect. Respect? Howie looked at me in disbelief. For what? For abandoning my mom and me emotionally for all these years? For blowing all your money and now sitting on my neck? For trying to cheat me out of that loan? I wasn't trying to cheat you, I insisted. I was going to tell you when it's too late to make a difference? Howie interrupted me. No, father. No more lies. No more manipulation. No more living off me. His voice echoed through the house. In the silence, I heard the door slam upstairs. Grace was probably trying to keep Pearl out of our fight. Do you want me to go? I asked quietly. Is that what you're trying to say? Yes, Howie answered without hesitation. I want you to leave. Now. I stared at him, not believing my ears. My own son was kicking me out of his house. Where am I going to go? I asked, and my voice sounded strange even to myself. Subtle, almost childish. That's not my problem, Howie cut me off. You're a grown man. You always said you could take care of yourself. Prove it. I saw a coldness in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. Not anger, not frustration, but coldness, a complete lack of emotional connection. Okay, I said, straightening up. I'll leave. Give me half an hour to pack. Howie nodded and crossed his arms over his chest, as if he expected me to change my mind, to beg. But I wasn't going to. Pride was the only thing I had left, and I wasn't about to lose it too. I turned to go upstairs when I heard the stomping of small feet on the stairs. Pearl was running downstairs, her face red with tears. Papa! She screamed, running into the hallway. Papa, you shouldn't have said that! A worried Gracie followed her down the stairs. Pearl, I told you to stay in your room, she began, but Pearl wouldn't listen. You can't throw Grandpa out! She ran up to Howie and grabbed his arm. He's your daddy. He loves you. Pearl, you don't understand. Howie squatted down in front of his daughter. This is grown-up stuff. It's better for Grandpa to live apart from us. No. Pearl shook her head stubbornly. You don't know. You don't know what Grandpa did for you. Howie frowned. What are you talking about? About this. Pearl pulled a shabby leather-bound notebook from behind her back. My heart skipped a beat. My diary. I thought I'd lost it when I moved, but apparently it had somehow ended up among the things I'd brought with me. Where did you get it? I asked, trying to sound calm. In your room, Pearl admitted guiltily. I was looking for a picture book and I found this. It's your handwriting, Grandpa. Pearl, you can't take other people's things without permission, Howie said automatically, but his eyes were fixed on the notebook. I know, Pearl lowered her head, but it said something about Daddy, how Grandpa loved him and took care of him. Give it to me. Howie held out his hand for the notebook. No, Pearl took a step back. Listen to it first. And before either of us could stop her, she opened the notebook and began to read, stuttering over the difficult words. Today was Howie's 16th birthday. I couldn't be at his birthday party. Work at the office dragged on into the night. Evelyn said he was disappointed, but understood. He always understands. Understands too well for a boy his age. I should be grateful for that, but instead I feel guilty. Tomorrow I'll take the last installment to Riverside College. The principal promised that Howie would get a scholarship if I contributed that amount as a donation. Evelyn doesn't know. She thinks Howie did what he deserves, and that's the way it should be. He must never find out that his father actually bought him a place. But what else could I do? His grades were good, but not high enough for a scholarship, and Riverside College has been his dream since childhood. Pearl stopped and raised her eyes to her father. See? Grandpa helped you get into college. He loved you. Howie stood motionless, his face white as chalk. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Was it true? He asked hoarsely. Did you paid for my admission? I nodded, unable to utter a word. It was one of my most shameful secrets. I'd always prided myself on my honesty, my straightforwardness. But for Howie's sake, I was willing to make a deal with my conscience. I couldn't let his dream be shattered by reality, a reality where talent and hard work aren't always enough. Why didn't you ever speak up? Howie looked shocked. I didn't want you to feel like you didn't deserve your place, I answered quietly. You were a good student, Howie. It was just, the competition was too much. And I knew how much this college meant to you. Howie looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. All these years he'd thought he'd gotten in because of his effort and ability. Now that illusion was shattered. How much? He asked hoarsely. How much did you pay? I hesitated. It was a huge sum for those days. 15,000, I said at last. It was all our savings and my brother's loan. 15,000, Howie repeated as if he didn't believe it. In '99, that's a fortune. For us, I nodded. But it was your dream, Howie. You've always talked about Riverside ever since you were 12. Pearl shifted her gaze from her father to me and back again, not quite understanding the significance of what she had just revealed, but sensing that something important had happened. Grandfather, what is an endowment? She asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but Howie beat me to it. It's when you give money to something good, honey, he said, not taking his eyes off me. Only sometimes it's not really fair. Sometimes it's a way to buy something that shouldn't be for sale. How's the college place? Pearl asked, realizing more than we thought. Yeah, Howie nodded, like a place in college. He slowly lowered himself into the chair as if his legs refused to hold him up. His face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, something I couldn't pinpoint. All these years, he said quietly. All these years I thought I'd achieved everything on my own, that I was good enough to get into one of the best colleges in the state, that my grades, my extracurriculars, my essays, that all of those things mattered. They mattered, I countered. You were a good student, Howie. Just not good enough, he finished for me. Not good enough to get in without Daddy's money. There was so much bitterness in his voice that I physically felt the pain. I wanted to say something to comfort him, to explain that my actions were motivated by love, not mistrust of his abilities. But the words stuck in my throat. Howie, Gracie walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. It's been a long time coming. You proved your worth many times after you enrolled. You graduated from college with honors. You built a career. Thanks to a false start, Howie interrupted her. Thanks to a lie. I could feel the color pouring down my face. It was my biggest secret, my deepest secret. I'd always feared that if Howie found out, it would destroy his faith in himself. And now my worst fears were coming true. Do you want to know why I did it? I asked quietly. Because you worked so hard, Howie. You studied late every day. You joined all those clubs and sports teams. You wrote those essays over and over until they were perfect. You did everything you could, and the system still said no. Not because you weren't good enough, but because the other kids had advantages you didn't have. What advantages? Howie asked defiantly. Parents with education and connections, I replied. Private schools, tutors, summer programs, all the things we couldn't afford on a postal worker's salary. I couldn't let your dreams be shattered by the reality that it's not enough to be just good. You have to be exceptional or have the right connections. Howie was silent, but I could see the emotions struggling in his eyes. Anger, frustration, maybe even understanding. You tricked me, he said finally. You let me believe something that wasn't true. I gave you the opportunity you deserved, I countered. What happened after you got in is your credit, Howie. Your grades, your accomplishments, your career. I only opened the door. You walked through it on your own. We looked at each other across the hallway, father and son, separated by decades of misunderstandings and unspoken words. I wanted him to realize that everything I did, even the things that were wrong, I did out of love, out of a desire to give him a better life than I had. I don't know what to think, Howie said, looking at the journal in his hands. My whole life is built on lies. Not all of it, Gracie said softly. Only the beginning. Everything else is the result of your own efforts. Howie shook his head as if he hadn't heard her. I need to be alone, he said, and turned to leave. Howie, I called out to him. I'm going anyway, just like you wanted. He stopped without turning around. It doesn't matter now, he said quietly. I have to sort myself out." He went up the stairs, and a moment later we heard his office door slam shut. It was just me, Gracie, and Pearl in the hallway. The silence was so thick it seemed as if it could be touched. "What now?" Gracie asked quietly. "I'm going anyway," I said, surprised at my calm. "Howie needs time and space." "But where will you go?" There was a genuine concern in her voice that touched me. "There's an inexpensive motel on the outskirts of town," I answered. "I'll stay there for a few days until I decide what to do next." "I can talk to Howie," Gracie suggested. "He's just in shock right now. When he calms down—" "No," I shook my head. "It has to be his decision. And frankly, I think he's right. I don't belong here." "But grandfather," Pearl tugged at my sleeve, "I don't want you to leave." I knelt down so I was level with her. "I'll visit you, I promise," I said, trying to sound more cheerful than I really felt. "And you can call me whenever you want." "Really?" Her eyes filled with tears, and it broke my heart. "Of course," I smiled at her. "Wizards never disappear forever." She hugged me, wrapping her small arms around my neck, and I felt something clench in my chest. This goodbye was as painful as losing her home 3 months ago. "I'm going to go pack," I said, gently releasing myself from her embrace. In my room, I mechanically put my clothes in my suitcase, my books in a box, my toiletries in my bag. So few things for a lifetime. So little to show that I was here, that I existed. I found an envelope and wrote Howie's name on it. Inside I put money, everything I had. It wasn't much, but maybe it would help him believe that I wasn't trying to use him, that I wasn't a parasite living off him. Finishing packing, I looked around the room one last time. It was as impersonal again as it had been the day I'd first stepped through the threshold of this house. It was as if I'd never been here. Gracie was waiting for me downstairs. She insisted on driving me to the motel despite my protests. "It's the least I can do," she said firmly. "And Howie would agree with me if he could think straight right now." Pearl stood beside her, still in tears, but quieter now, resigned to the inevitable. "I'll miss you, Grandpa Wizard," she said as I leaned over to hug her goodbye. "I'll miss you too, Sunshine," I replied, feeling the stinging in my eyes. "But remember what I said. Wizards never disappear forever." I left the envelope on the hallway table where Howie would be sure to find it. Then we walked out into the evening gloom, and I took one last look back at the house that had briefly been mine. In the window of the second-floor study, I noticed Howie's silhouette. He stood looking down, but when he saw me looking, he quickly retreated into the shadows. I got into Gracie's car, and we hit the road. Howie's house got smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it finally disappeared around the corner. Another house I'd lost. Another beginning that turned out to be the end. I apologize for the error. Your request said to write Chapter 5, At the Crossroads. I started writing Chapter 4 by mistake. I will now write the correct chapter as planned. The security booth in the Doug's parking lot was no bigger than a telephone booth, a plastic chair, a small heater, an old TV, and a logbook to record the license plate numbers of incoming cars. But for me, having spent 2 weeks in a featureless motel room, it was almost home. At least here I felt needed. I had a purpose, even if that purpose was just to sit around all night guarding other people's cars. "Hey, Abbott, shift's over," the voice of Raymond, the day watchman, snapped me out of my reverie. "Are you daydreaming again?" I glanced at my watch, 6 in the morning. Indeed, my 12-hour shift had come to an end, and I hadn't noticed. I'd spent the last few hours rereading old letters I'd found among my things. Her neat handwriting, her warm words, they were the only connection to a past I'd lost. Pensive, I stood up, gathering my things. "A lot of cars at night?" "You logged it," said Raymond, a man in his 50s with a bushy mustache and a face always red from the wind. "Or did you forget again?" I checked the logbook. The last entry was made at 2 o'clock in the morning when the last car arrived. After that, I must have fallen into reminiscence and forgotten my duties. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling ashamed. "It won't happen again." Raymond waved his hand. "Come on, there's nothing going on here anyway. Doug just wants someone in the booth to keep the vandals away." He paused, looking at me sympathetically. "You okay, man?" "You don't look okay." I wasn't okay. 3 weeks had passed since I'd left Howie's house, and every day was a struggle with loneliness, with financial hardship, with feeling like life was passing me by. But I wasn't about to share that with Raymond, who I barely knew. "I'm fine," I lied. "I just didn't sleep well." "Well, go get some rest." Raymond took my place in the booth. "I'll see you tomorrow." I nodded and went outside. It was a cold morning, and I pulled my old jacket tighter around me. The motel was a 20-minute walk from the parking lot. Not too far, but at my 68, every walk was a challenge, especially after a night shift. On the way, I stopped at Maggie's, a small diner where I'd become a regular customer in recent weeks. Maggie, a full middle-aged woman with bright red hair, greeted me with a smile. "Good morning, Eustace. The usual?" "Morning, Maggie. Yes, please." I sat at my usual table by the window, watching the city wake up. The school bus passed by, full of sleepy children. Among them might have been Pearl, my granddaughter. The thought of her squeezed my heart with a painful longing. I missed her most of all, her laughter, her strange questions, the way she called me Grandpa Wizard. Maggie brought me coffee and toast and eggs, my standard breakfast. It was all I could afford on a night watchman's salary. Fortunately, Doug paid in cash, no questions asked, and he wasn't embarrassed by my age. "Just as long as you don't sleep or drink on your shift," he said when he hired me. "You look tired, honey," Maggie said, lingering at my table. "Maybe you should take the day off." "I can't," I replied. "I need the money." Maggie shook her head. "You're too old for night shifts, Eustace. You need to find something better." Something better was an unattainable dream. In 3 weeks, I'd been to dozens of places offering my services. Every time I got the same answer: "We're looking for someone younger." Doug was the only one who gave me a chance, and I clung to the job like a drowning man to a straw. "I'm fine, Maggie," I said, trying to sound chipper. "I'll get used to the schedule." She clearly didn't believe me, but she didn't insist. Instead, she placed an extra toast on the table. "It's on the house," she said with a wink. "You need your strength." I wanted to refuse, my pride not allowing me to accept a handout. But hunger was stronger, and I nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Maggie." By the time I finished my breakfast, the cafe was already filled with morning customers. Office workers hurrying to eat before the day began, retirees in no hurry, young mothers with their children. I watched them, feeling like a ghost, invisible, inaudible, non-existent to this world of normal people with normal lives. After paying, I walked outside and continued toward the motel. Cars were passing by, hurrying about their business. One of them, a blue sedan, looked familiar, the same car Gracie drove. But it couldn't be her. Why would she be in this part of town at this hour? I walked to the motel, feeling my legs getting heavier with each step. Fatigue piled up like a thick blanket, clouding my thoughts. All I wanted to do now was fall onto the bed and fall into a dreamless sleep. The receptionist, a sleepy guy in his early 20s, nodded at me as I passed the counter. We already knew each other well enough to dispense with greetings. I opened the door to my room and froze on the threshold. Pearl was sitting on the bed, dangling her feet and looking at the book I'd left on the nightstand. "Hi, Grandpa Wizard," she said, as if it was the most normal thing to be sitting in my room at 7 in the morning on a school day. "Pearl?" I couldn't believe my eyes. "What are you doing here? How did you get here?" "My mom brought me," she answered, as if that explained everything. "She's waiting in the car. Said I had to be quick because I had school coming up, so it really was Gracie's car. But why? Mom said you were working at night and should be back soon," Pearl continued. "I wanted to give you this." She handed me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and saw a drawing a figure with a long beard, I must be me, and a little girl with red hair, holding hands. Above them was written in stubby letters, "Grandpa the Wizard and Pearl." "It's beautiful, Sunshine," I said, feeling a lump come up in my throat. "Thank you." "I miss you," Pearl said simply. "Why don't you come to visit?" I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a 6-year-old the complexities of adult relationships? How to say that her father might not want to see me? "I was busy," I said, choosing the simplest explanation. "New job, you know." Pearl nodded gravely. "Dad's always busy too, but he's sad sometimes now, especially when he's reading your book." "My book?" I didn't understand at first. "The one with your handwriting on it," Pearl explained. "He sometimes sits in his study and reads it, and then he stares out the window for a long time. My diary. So how he read it. I wonder what he thinks now that he knows all my secrets, all my doubts and fears." "Pearl, honey, we have to go." Gracie's voice came from the door I'd forgotten to close. She stood there, shuffling awkwardly from foot to foot. "Hi, Eustace." "Gracie," I nodded, not knowing how to react to her appearance. "I didn't expect to see you." "Pearl really wanted to visit you," she said, avoiding my gaze. "We found out where you work from Dolores. Her husband runs a diner near the parking lot. Small town, everybody knows everything. I should have known. She can't be late for school, Gracie continued, but maybe you could make time to come visit us. Pearl misses me. I looked at my granddaughter, who was looking at me hopefully with her big eyes. And Howie? I asked quietly so Pearl wouldn't hear. Gracie hesitated. He doesn't mind, she said finally. He just needs time. But he's not stopping you from seeing Pearl. I wasn't sure if that was true. Maybe Gracie was just being kind. But the thought of seeing Pearl again, regularly, was too tempting to pass up. I'll come, I said. Maybe this weekend? Pearl's eyes shone. Really? You'll come to our house? If it's okay with your parents, I said carefully. We'd love to, Gracie said, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. Howie. He needs to talk to you too, when he's ready. That was unexpected. I thought Howie had cut me out of his life after our last fight. The thought that he might want to talk to me gave me a strange feeling, a mixture of hope and anxiety. Okay, I said. I'll come on Saturday if that's convenient. Saturday's great, Gracie nodded. And now we really must go. Pearl, say goodbye to Grandpa. Pearl hugged me, and I could smell her hair, a strawberry-scented shampoo, like the one Evelyn used. See you Saturday, Grandpa Wizard, she said. I'll show you my new drawings. You will, sweetheart, I smiled, trying to hide my excitement. I'll be waiting. They left, and I was alone in the room, which suddenly seemed even more empty and impersonal than usual. But now I had hope, a little light in the darkness that might, with luck, turn into a real flame. I put Pearl's drawing on the nightstand and lay back on the bed. Sleep, which had recently seemed the only desirable state, wasn't coming. My mind was spinning with thoughts of the upcoming meeting, of Howie, of what he might have read in my journal. I'd kept that journal for almost 20 years, ever since the therapist I'd seen during my depression after my father's death had advised me to write down my thoughts. At first I was skeptical. Real men don't write diaries. But gradually it became a habit, even a need. I wrote down everything I couldn't say out loud, my fears, my hopes, my doubts. I wrote down how I feared I wasn't good enough for Evelyn, that she deserved a better husband, how afraid I was failing as a father, that I was missing something important in raising Howie, how afraid that my job was the only thing I was truly competent at, and so I clung to it, spending more and more time in the office and less time at home. I wrote down how proud I was of Howie when he won the school math Olympiad, how worried he was when he fell in love for the first time and got rejected, how I sat silently in the car holding back tears after I drove him to college and left him there, knowing our family life would never be the same again. I wrote down how I struggled with making the decision to donate to the college, how I hated myself for taking that deal, how I comforted myself with the thought that I was doing it for Howie, for his future. If Howie read all this, if he saw my inner struggle, my doubts, my love for him hidden behind a mask of alienation, maybe he could understand me better than he ever had before. The thought was both reassuring and frightening. I'd always hidden my true feelings, thinking it was a show of strength. Now my soul was naked in front of my son, unprotected, without barriers. With these thoughts, I finally fell into a restless sleep in which I dreamed of diary pages flying in the wind, and I ran after them, trying to collect them, but they slipped away from me like autumn leaves. I woke up toward evening, feeling wrecked. My head ached, and my throat was dry. I struggled to get up, waddled to the small sink in the corner of the room, and drank some water straight from the tap. Then I glanced in the mirror and didn't recognize the man who was staring back at me. A gaunt face, sunken eyes, gray stubble that made me look even older. I looked like a man who had given up, and maybe I had, until today, until Pearl's visit. Now I had a purpose, a reason to clean myself up, to find a better place to live, maybe even a more decent job. I wanted Pearl to be proud of her grandfather, not ashamed of him. I showered, shaved, put on the cleanest shirt I could find. Then I went outside and headed to the library, the only place I could use the internet for free to look for a job. The Moreno Valley Library was small but cozy. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Page, already knew me and nodded friendly when I walked in. "Looking for work again, Mr. Abbott?" she asked as I approached the counter. "Yes," I replied. "Can I use the computer?" "Sure," she pointed to an empty seat by the window. "The third computer is free. And by the way, I heard that the post office needs a part-time person. Sorting mail, nothing too complicated." My heart's beating faster. the post office. A place I'd worked for 30 years. A place I knew like the back of my hand. "Thanks for the information," I said, trying not to show my excitement. "I'll be sure to look into it." I sat down at my computer and opened the job site. Indeed, the Moreno Valley Post Office was looking for a part-time sorter. The requirements were minimal: basic computer skills, physical stamina, no experience required. It was the perfect job for me. No night shift, stable salary, maybe even health insurance. And most importantly, a job I knew well and loved. I printed out the application form and filled it out right there in the library. My handwriting, once crisp and neat, was now shaky and uncertain. But the information was more important than the beauty of my handwriting. In the experience column, I wrote the truth. 30 years in the Postal Service, the last 15 of them as a branch manager. In the column reason for leaving my last job, I wrote retirement. In the references column, I put the name of my former deputy, if he was still working. When I finished, I reread the form several times, checking for mistakes. Then I folded it up and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Tomorrow, before my shift in the parking lot, I'd drop it off at the post office. Leaving the library, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in a long time. I had a plan, and maybe even hope for a better future. On my way back to the motel, I stopped at a small store and bought a postcard with a picture of a wizard working on a cauldron. Inside I wrote, "For Pearl, from the wizard's grandfather. See you Saturday." Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about my upcoming meeting with Howie. What would I say to him? What would he say to me? Would we be able to overcome the wall of misunderstanding that had always stood between us? I didn't know the answers to those questions, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe there were answers, that maybe all was not lost. In the meantime, I had a job to do. I looked at the clock. It was almost 8 o'clock in the evening. It was time to get ready for the night shift. I changed into my work clothes, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and headed out into the night. The parking lot was almost empty at this hour. Raymond had already left, leaving his magazine on the table in the booth. I took my seat and prepared myself for a long night. But tonight the time didn't drag as painfully as it usually did. My mind was spinning with thoughts of my upcoming meeting with Pearl and Howie, of a possible job at the post office, of a future that was suddenly not so hopeless. Toward midnight, a blue sedan pulled into the parking lot. I recognized it immediately. It was Gracie's car. She stopped at the booth and the window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. "Eustace," Gracie said, smiling. "I wasn't sure I'd catch you." "Gracie?" I was surprised. "Did something happen?" "No, it's nothing. She hesitated. "Howie wanted me to give you this." She handed me an envelope. I took it, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Your journal," Gracie said. "Howie said he'd read enough. What's the rest of it? The rest you can tell him yourself, if you want to." I stared at the envelope, unable to say a word. My diary, my secrets, my fears and my hopes. Is he angry?" I finally asked. Gracie shook her head. "No, he's not mad. He's confused. He needs time to process everything he's learned. But he wants to talk to you, when he's ready." I nodded, feeling strangely relieved. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but an opportunity, a chance. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "You're welcome," Gracie smiled. "I'll see you Saturday?" "We will," I confirmed. She left, and I sat in the booth, holding the envelope with the diary in it. I didn't bother opening it now. That could wait. Instead, I stared at the road Gracie's car had taken and thought about Howie. About my son, who, despite everything that had happened between us, still hadn't closed the door completely. Who might have been willing to listen to me, to understand me. It was a thin thread of hope, but I was going to hold on to it with all my might. Because sometimes a thin thread is all we have. And sometimes it's enough to start weaving a new fabric of a relationship, stronger and more secure than the old one. A small apartment on the first floor of an old house on the outskirts of Moreno Valley became my new home. One room, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom the size of a closet, but it was all mine. I could walk in my socks on the squeaky hardwood floors. I could cook eggs at 3 in the morning if I wanted to. I could listen to the radio without worrying about disturbing anyone. After 2 months in a motel, that feeling was priceless. My new home was modest, but I tried to make it cozy. At a thrift store, I bought a used chair with worn armrests and an old floor lamp that gave off a warm yellow light. At the flea market, I found a kitchen table and 2 chairs, one of which always had a stack of newspapers on it, and the other was where I'd sit by myself over my morning coffee. There were pictures hanging on the walls: Evelyn, young Howie, and the new one dearest to my heart, Pearl, smiling full mouth, showing the absence of a front tooth. I looked at those pictures every morning as I got ready for work. They reminded me of what I lived for. Working at the post office turned out to be exactly what I'd hoped it would be: quiet, familiar, with a comfortable schedule. Of course, I was not a supervisor, but a simple sorter, but that didn't bother me. There was even something peaceful in the monotonous work: sorting letters, checking addresses, putting parcels into delivery areas. I did it with my eyes closed, and it gave me a chance to think about other things, like Pearl, who visited me every Saturday. Gracie would bring her by 10 in the morning and pick her up at 3 in the afternoon. Those 5 hours were the happiest hours of my week. Pearl and I would go to the park if the weather was nice. We'd feed the ducks in the pond, swing on the swings, or rather, Pearl would swing, and I'd stand beside her, ready to pick her up at any moment, and eat ice cream while sitting on a bench and watching people walk by. She told me about her school, about her friends, about the new books her mom was reading to her. I listened, asked questions, laughed at her jokes. In those moments, I felt like a real grandfather, the way I was always supposed to be. In bad weather, we stayed in the apartment. I taught her how to play checkers and card games. We watched old cartoons on a small TV I bought at a thrift store. Sometimes we just sat and drew, she with colored pencils, me with a ballpoint pen. Her drawings adorned the refrigerator, the bathroom door, even the hall closet. We didn't talk much about Howie. Pearl mentioned him occasionally. Daddy said we're going to the movies tomorrow. Daddy fixed my doll, but I never asked. I was afraid of hearing something that would hurt me even more. Howie himself never came with Pearl, always Gracie. She was polite, asking how I was doing, telling me a little about her job, about her plans for the summer. But Howie stayed out of the picture, like a shadow in the background of our conversations. "He's still not ready," Gracie said one day, when Pearl ran off to the bathroom, and it was just the 2 of us. "But he doesn't mind your seeing Pearl. He sees how happy she is after them." I nodded, not knowing what to say. Part of me was grateful for that too, for Howie not forbidding me from seeing my granddaughter. The other part of me asked bitterly, did it really take a lifetime to be willing to have a conversation with my own father? On the day Howie and I finally came face to face, there was no way it was going to happen. It was a normal Thursday. I had just finished my shift at the post office and stopped by the supermarket to get groceries. I walked slowly between the rows, checking the list I held in my hand. Eggs, bread, milk, cheese, my usual bachelor's menu. I was standing at the shelf of canned goods, deciding which beans to choose, when I heard a familiar voice from behind me. "Dad?" I turned around. Howie was standing 2 feet away from me, basket in hand. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes, the wrinkles on his forehead more prominent than I remembered. But he was smooth-shaven, neatly dressed, a professional on his lunch break. "Howie," I said, feeling my heart start to beat faster. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I work nearby," he replied. "Sometimes I stop by on my lunch break." We stood looking at each other, not knowing what to say next. All around us, people were pushing carts, taking items from the shelves, rushing to the checkout counters. Just an ordinary day at the supermarket, for everyone but us. "How are you?" I finally asked. "How was work?" "It's okay," he shrugged. "Lots to do. How about you? Gracie said you got a job at the post office?" "Yeah, as a sorter, part-time." That's good." Silence again. I watched Howie shift from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. I'd known it since he was a kid. He always did it when he was nervous or wanted to leave. "Pearl says you have an apartment now," he said. "Yeah, it's small, but it's your own. Better than a motel." "That's good," he said again. "Pearl likes to come to your place." "I like it when she comes over," I said with genuine warmth. "She's a great kid, Howie. You and Gracie are raising her well." Something flashed in his eyes, maybe pride, maybe gratitude for the compliment. "Thank you," he said. "We're trying." I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell him how much I missed him, how I regretted my mistakes, how I wished I could start over. But the words stuck in my throat. Too many years of silence, the wounds too deep. "Well," Howie said, looking at his watch, "I should get back to work. It was, it was nice to see you. The standard phrase one says when meeting former coworkers, distant acquaintances, not with a father you haven't seen in months. Yeah, sure, I nodded. Say hi to Gracie. I will. He was already turning to leave when I made up my mind. Howie, I called out to him. Why don't you come over sometime? I could make dinner, or just, talk. He froze, not turning around. I could see his shoulders tense. I don't know, Father, he said finally. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I understand, I said, though I didn't really understand. I didn't understand how you could not be ready to talk to the man who had given you life. The man who, despite all the mistakes, loved you more than anything. When you're ready, if you are. He nodded without turning around and walked away. I watched him walk between the rows, pay at the register, leave the store, my son. So close and so far away at the same time. I sat home alone that night, with an unfinished dinner on the table and a bottle of beer I'd bought impulsively after meeting Howie. I'd barely had a drink since I'd left them, but tonight I felt like I needed one. I thought about our meeting, going over every word, every gesture in my head. I tried to find some sign in them, some hope that all was not lost. But all I saw was cold politeness, only the wall Howie had built between us. I pulled out my journal, the same one Howie had given me back through Gracie. In the last few pages, I'd written down my thoughts on life without my family, my new job, my meetings with Pearl. Now I wrote down this meeting as well, trying to make sense of my feelings. Saw Howie today, I wrote. He looks tired. I wonder if it's because of work or something else. He's polite but cold, like he's talking to a stranger. Maybe I am a stranger to him. Maybe all these years I've been a stranger in my own family. I closed the journal and set my pen aside. There was no answer to these questions. Or maybe the answer was too painful to admit. On Saturday, as usual, Pearl arrived. She jumped out of Gracie's car with her backpack over her shoulders and ran to me, spreading her arms for a hug. "Grandpa," she shouted, "I have a surprise for you." I picked her up and spun her around, enjoying her laughter. "What kind of surprise, sweetie?" "I learned how to make origami," she announced proudly. "Ms. Chen showed us at school, and I made you a swan." She rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a paper figure. It was a little crooked with bent corners, but to me it was the most beautiful swan in the world. "It's beautiful," I said sincerely. "Thank you, Pearl. I'll put it in the most prominent place." "I could teach you," she offered. "It wouldn't be very difficult. Well, if you're good at folding paper flat." "I'd be happy to learn," I said, smiling. We said goodbye to Gracie, who, as usual, promised to be back at 3 o'clock, and went into the apartment. Pearl ran straight to the refrigerator to see if her drawings were in place, to add a new one. Then she took out origami paper from her backpack, bright squares of all the colors of the rainbow. "First, you have to make a basic shape," she explained, sitting down at the table. "It's easy. Watch." I sat down next to her and followed her instructions, trying to fold the paper exactly along the lines. My hands, calloused from work and time, didn't obey as well as her little fingers. My swan was even more crooked than hers. "It's okay," she consoled me, noticing my disappointment. "It's very good for your first time. Dad couldn't do it at all. He said his fingers were too big for it." "Your dad showed you?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah," Pearl nodded. "Last night. I said I wanted to teach you, so I showed him first. To practice." I felt a strange warmth in my chest. Howie knew Pearl wanted to teach me origami, and he didn't forbid it. Maybe even encouraged her. "Daddy said you'd probably be better at origami than he was," Pearl continued, folding a new square of paper. "Because you've had a lot of experience with paper at the post office." "He said that?" My heart skipped a beat. "Uh-huh. And he also said that you were always very neat in everything you did, that you taught him how to fold his shirt so there were no creases." I remembered that. I remembered showing teenage Howie how to fold his clothes properly before he went to summer camp. I didn't think he'd memorized it, or that it mattered to him. "Does your daddy talk about me a lot?" I asked cautiously. Pearl hesitated, her little face serious. "Not very much," she admitted. "But sometimes when I tell him what we did together, he asks. And sometimes he tells me things himself. How you went fishing and you taught him how to tie a tricky knot on the line, a double bloody knot. I showed it to Howie when he was about 10. We rarely went fishing, maybe 3 or 4 times in his entire childhood. But he remembered, and he told his daughter. "Are you asking about Grandpa?" I asked. "Of course," Pearl shrugged. as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You're my grandfather, and I want to know what you were like when Daddy was little, like me. Her simple logic made me smile. Kids see things so clearly, so simply, without the complexities that adults add. And what does your daddy think of our meetings? I couldn't resist asking. Pearl stopped folding the paper for a second and looked at me with her serious eyes. He says it's good that I have a grandfather, she said, that all children should know their grandparents. He's right, I nodded. But sometimes he's sad when I come home and tell him how we spent the day, Pearl added in a quieter voice. He doesn't talk, but I can tell. His eyes get like a sad dog's. I felt something clench in my chest. Howie is sad hearing about our meetings. But why? Because of jealousy? Because of memories? Or is it something else I don't understand? Adults sometimes get sad for strange reasons, I said carefully. Sometimes they don't even know why. Pearl nodded with the look of a little philosopher. I know. Like Mom when she looks at old pictures and cries, but she says she's not sad. Exactly, I agreed. Adults are strange creatures. But you're not weird, Pearl said with conviction. You're just Grandpa the Wizard. And we went back to folding paper figures, to the simple pleasures of a Saturday afternoon. When Gracie came to pick up Pearl, I went out to walk them to the car. Pearl ran ahead to show her mom the paper figures we had made, and Gracie and I walked behind her. How was your day? She asked. Great, I answered. Pearl taught me how to make origami. Yeah, she's been practicing all week, Gracie smiled. She'd been practicing with Howie. She told me, I paused. I met Howie on Thursday, at the supermarket. I know, Gracie nodded. He told me. How is he? I asked, unable to help myself. Gracie sighed. He's confused, Eustace. He doesn't know what to feel. On the one hand, he's angry at you for keeping the truth from him all these years. On the other hand, he's starting to understand why you did it, and it's confusing him. I nodded, not knowing what to say. I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing myself, keeping the truth about the donation to the college for my son. Maybe if I'd told him sooner, we wouldn't be in this situation now. He needs time, Gracie continued. But I can see a change. He used to get angry when I mentioned your name. Now he's thinking. Sometimes he asks how you are. He does? I couldn't hide my surprise. Yes, she smiled weakly. Not often, but he asks. And he listens when Pearl talks about your meetings. He used to leave the room. It wasn't much, but more than I expected. More than I dared hope for after our cold encounter at the supermarket. Thanks for telling me, I said. And thanks for bringing Pearl. It means a lot to me. I know, Gracie nodded. It does to her too. She's counting the days until Saturday. We walked to the car where Pearl was already fastening her seatbelt in the back seat. See you next Saturday, Grandpa, she shouted, waving her hand. See you Saturday, sweetheart, I waved back. Be a good girl. Always, she laughed. Gracie got behind the wheel and they drove off. I stood on the sidewalk staring after them until the car went around the corner. Then I walked slowly back to the house. On the table were the paper figures we'd made with Pearl. Swans, cranes, some indefinable creatures she called fantasy animals. I gathered them up and arranged them neatly on the bookshelf. Little paper souvenirs, reminders of a happy day. Then I sat down in my chair and turned on the radio. An old song was playing that Evelyn and I used to love when we were young. I closed my eyes, letting the music take me back to a time when things were simpler, when I hadn't yet made the mistakes that ruined my family, when I still had a chance to be a better father, a better husband, a better man. But you can't change the past. All that remains is the present, with its pain, with its hope, with its little joys, like the paper figures on the shelf, like Saturdays with Pearl, like the rare, scant news about Howie that Gracie brings. And maybe the future. A future in which I can right at least some of my wrongs. A future in which my son can, if not forgive me, at least understand me. A future where we can look each other in the eye without pain and anger. Maybe that future is already beginning. By the tiny steps, by the subtle changes, by the questions Howie asks about me, by the stories he tells Pearl, by the fact that he doesn't forbid her from seeing me, even knowing how much she's attached to a grandfather she might lose the way he lost his father. I didn't know if my hopes would come true. I didn't know if Howie and I would ever be able to really talk, to open our hearts to each other, to forgive past hurts. I didn't know if my small apartment would ever be a place where he would come, not just to drop off or pick up Pearl, but to see me, to be with me. I didn't know, but I hoped. And in the end, hope is all we have. Hope and love, and the little paper swans we make with those we care about.